A cold winter night in Paris. The late winter night in Paris was freezing, with the wind howling through the narrow streets, sweeping up thin layers of snow that scattered across the cobblestone sidewalks. The damp pavement reflected the dim glow of the old street lamps, stretching out trembling shadows into the darkness. The shops lining the street had long since closed, leaving only a few cafes with warm golden lights spilling through their Pais windows, where the last remaining customers lingered over their steaming cups of coffee. In the distance, the clattering of horse-drawn carriages blended with the occasional murmur of drunken souls staggering home. Inside a small bakery on the corner of Rue Saint-Honoré, Jacques Moreau was tidying up for the night. The rich aroma of butter and flour still lingered in the air, mingling with the fading warmth from the oven after a long day of baking. He exhaled softly, watching as a faint white mist escaped his lips when the door creaked open, letting in a gust of icy air from outside. The seasoned baker carefully did a final check, placing the leftover pastries into a basket. Only 3 croissants remained on the tray, golden, flaky, and fragrant, but no longer warm. Jacques had planned to take them home for his wife and son, a small tradition he kept at the end of each day. He glanced at the old clock hanging on the wall. Almost midnight. Louis, his son, was surely fast asleep by now, and his wife was probably waiting by the fireplace with a cup of peppermint tea, as she always did. Then suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. Jacques turned his head. Through the glass window, he saw a small figure standing quietly outside the bakery. A child. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, the girl huddled into the corner, as if trying to make herself invisible against the biting cold. Her thin coat was hardly enough to shield her from the freezing air, and her small hands clutched the hem of her garment, trembling slightly. But what caught Jacques' attention most was her eyes, locked onto the remaining croissants on the tray. Eyes filled with hunger, a mixture of longing and hesitation, desperate yet wary. Jacques furrowed his brows. He had seen many homeless people wandering through these streets, but there was something about this girl that made him unable to look away. Slowly, he removed his apron, stepped out from behind the counter, and gently pushed open the door, allowing the warmth from inside to seep out. "Little one," he said in a deep, gentle voice, "would you like a pastry?" The girl flinched. For a moment, a flicker of suspicion flashed in her eyes before she quickly nodded. Jacques smiled, reached into the display case, and carefully took out a croissant. But before he could hand it to her, the girl snatched it quickly and bolted into the night, vanishing into the darkness. No words of gratitude, no glance back. Jacques stood frozen at the bakery door, his hands still suspended in midair, the warmth of the croissant fading into the cold night air. The girl had disappeared so quickly, so completely, as if she had never been there at all. Only the wind remained, sweeping through the narrow alley, carrying away the last remnants of warmth from a long day. He exhaled slowly, his breath turning to mist, his gaze still fixed on the empty street. A strange feeling stirred within him, something deeper than sympathy. It wasn't anger nor surprise. It was a ghost from the past. Those eyes, hunger, longing, and yet wariness. Jacques had seen them before. Etienne. The name sliced through his memory like a blade, dragging him back to a time long gone. A boy, thin and weary, standing silently outside their family bakery all those years ago. But Etienne never asked for bread. He only stood there, watching, before turning away without a word. And one day, Etienne never came back. A sharp gust of wind howled through the streets, yanking Jacques back to the present. He lifted a hand to his face, startled by how cold his fingers had become. A voice pulled him further into reality. Bernard, an old acquaintance, stood nearby, watching with mild amusement. He took a slow drag from his cigarette before exhaling a cloud of smoke into the night air. "I told you, Jacques," Bernard muttered. "These street kids. You help them once, and they'll keep coming back, again and again. And before you know it, you'll have a pack of beggars loitering in front of your shop." Jacques said nothing, but a heavy weight settled in his chest. Was the girl truly ungrateful? Or was it merely the reflex of someone who had lived in hardship for too long? Someone who had never been given the luxury of politeness, who had no space in her life for meaningless words of thanks? Just like Etienne. "Maybe," Jacques said at last, his voice quiet yet firm. "She doesn't know that she's allowed to accept kindness." Bernard let out a dry chuckle. Kindness? He shook his head. In this world, everyone has to fend for themselves, Jacques. If you get too soft, you'll only bring trouble upon yourself. Jacques clenched his fist, feeling the winter chill seep into his fingers. He understood Bernard's way of thinking. Perhaps most people thought the same. But if only he had held Etienne back that night, if he had reached out instead of just standing there, would things have been different? This time he wouldn't repeat his mistake. Jacques turned to Bernard, his expression calm but resolute. I have to go, Bernard. There's something I need to do. Without waiting for a response, he pulled off his apron, threw on his overcoat, and stepped into the cold night. Paris, winter of 1887. The city of light never truly slept, but in its darkest corners, the night swallowed those who had been forgotten. While aristocrats and merchants waltzed in grand ballrooms, the outer districts told a different story, one of struggle, toil, and survival. In the neighborhood where Jacques grew up, most people were laborers, blacksmiths, factory workers, street vendors, men and women who spent their days breaking their backs in textile mills, forges, or docks, only to receive a handful of francs in return. And beyond them, in the alleys reeking of filth and despair, were the ones who had nothing at all. The homeless, the abandoned children, the souls lost in the shadows of Paris. Etienne had grown up in a place like this. Their parents had once owned a small bakery, but life had never been kind. Between crushing taxes, rising flour prices, and factory strikes that disrupted business, they barely scraped by. Jacques accepted this reality, taking on responsibilities to help their family survive. But Etienne was different. He despised the scent of yeast clinging to his skin, the early mornings before the city awoke, the endless struggle for mere survival. He wanted more than the narrow streets and the crumbling bakery. One day you'll see, Jacques, Etienne had said, his eyes burning with ambition. I'll have a different life. I won't die in this bakery. And then, one night, he left. The last time Jacques saw his brother alive, Etienne stood beneath a flickering gas lamp on the opposite side of the street. His coat was tattered, his grip tight around a silver coin. He had smiled, a smile full of dreams, of defiance, and of goodbye. Don't worry, Jacques, I'll be fine. But Etienne wasn't fine. He never found the dream he had chased. Only dark alleyways, an empty stomach, and the fever chills of a Parisian winter. Until one day Jacques found him, lying lifeless on a freezing sidewalk, his eyes closed forever, a stale piece of bread clutched in his hand. Etienne had died of hunger. Jacques clenched his fists, a wave of helplessness crashing over him. I should have done something. For years that thought haunted him. He should have held Etienne back. He should have stopped him from leaving, from running after illusions that led only to despair. He should have, but in the end, Jacques had done nothing. He knelt beside his brother's cold body, his hands trembling as he gently closed Etienne's unseeing eyes. In his grip, Etienne still held the last remnants of his life, a stale piece of bread and an old silver coin. Jacques wrapped his fingers around the coin, its icy surface pressing into his palm. His voice broke as he whispered into the unforgiving Parisian wind, "Forgive me, Etienne." A sharp gust howled through the empty street, pulling Jacques back to the present. His hands clenched instinctively, but there was no silver coin between his fingers now. Only the lingering weight of a memory buried deep yet never forgotten. Before him, the alley where the girl had disappeared was now nothing but darkness and winter's bitter chill. And yet something about that fleeting moment refused to let go. A shadow in the night, in a narrow alleyway hidden behind an old church, the girl ran. She held the croissant tightly against her chest, its buttery scent cutting through the biting cold. But she didn't stop to eat. Her small feet pounded against the cobblestone streets, weaving through the shadows, dodging the wary glances of passers-by. Because in her world, stopping meant being caught, and being caught meant losing everything. At last, she stopped in front of a low iron gate, hidden behind a moss-covered wall. The street was silent. Slipping through a narrow gap, she darted across a small, overgrown garden, climbed up the drain pipe with practiced ease, and reached a closed window. Inside, a faint glow flickered. She knocked softly, 3 times. A moment later, the window creaked open, and a boy peered out. He was only a little older than her, his face thin and pale, but his eyes lit up with hope at the sight of the pastry in her hands. Clément, I got it, she whispered, holding out the croissant. The boy grabbed it eagerly, his frail fingers trembling as he clutched it. But instead of taking a bite immediately, he looked up at her, his voice hoarse with hunger. Did anyone see you? She shook her head, grinning. No one, I'm too fast. Clément exhaled in relief before finally sinking his teeth into the flaky pastry. For a brief moment, the simple joy of eating dulled the reality of his situation. But the dim moonlight glinted off the small chain fastened around his ankle, a cruel reminder that freedom was still far away. The girl grasped the iron bars of the window, lowering her voice. We'll escape soon, Clément, I promise. Clément took another slow bite, savoring the taste as long as he could. But no matter how good the croissant was, it couldn't change the fact that he was still trapped. A prisoner in the very home meant to protect him. The girl studied him, then glanced at the chain binding his ankle. The old iron lock gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Have you found a way to get it off? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clément shook his head, eyes fixed on the lock. I tried using the cook's hairpin, but it wouldn't open. It's too strong. I need a key. She bit her lip. A key? That meant only one thing. They would have to take it from the master of the house, the cruel man who kept Clément as if he were nothing more than an object to be owned. Tomorrow, she whispered, determination burning in her voice. I'll find a way inside. Clément hesitated. It's too dangerous. But she only flashed a mischievous smile. I'm faster than the wind, remember? Elodie raced through the cobblestone streets, her small figure blending into the shadows. The icy wind bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. There was only one thought running through her mind. How do I get the key? How long had Clément been locked away in that house? He never said outright, but the faded scars on his wrists and the way he was always on edge told Elodie everything she needed to know. He had endured enough. And now she would end it. That winter night, Paris was a dull shade of gray, its narrow streets swept by freezing winds, damp from an endless drizzle. Elodie huddled beneath the awning of an old grocery store, clutching the hem of her tattered coat. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she was used to it. Across the street, an old man stepped out of a bakery, a bag full of warm, fragrant pastries in hand. As he walked by, a silver coin slipped from his pocket, rolling across the pavement until it landed near Elodie's feet. She hesitated, but before she could reach for it, another hand snatched it first. Elodie's gaze snapped up. A boy around her age stood before her. His woolen coat and neatly tucked trousers were far too clean for a street child. He wasn't like the others she usually saw wandering the alleys. But what caught her attention the most was his eyes, a pale green, sharp and guarded. Give it back, Elodie said, her voice steady despite its quietness. The boy clutched the coin tightly in his palm. Why, you didn't even touch it. But it fell in front of me. The boy raised an eyebrow as if amused that a ragged child like her would dare argue. I saw it first, but I need it more. A brief silence. The wind howled past, cutting through their standoff. Then at last, the boy opened his hand and held out the coin. Here, a friendship born in the shadows. Elodie narrowed her eyes. Why are you giving it to me? The boy shrugged. You look like you need it more. She studied him for a moment before snatching the coin and clenching it tightly in her palm. My name is Clément, the boy said. Elodie turned away. Why do you care? Clément smiled. Because I think we'll meet again. She didn't respond, but as she walked away, she could still hear the soft chuckle of the boy lingering in the cold Parisian air. After that fateful encounter outside the bakery, Clément and Elodie's connection did not end with a mere silver coin. Clément, though born into luxury, lived behind high walls bound by rules and the cold stares of his parents. Elodie, despite having nothing, was freer than anyone Clément had ever known. At first, he sought her out simply out of curiosity, but over time it became something more, something even he couldn't fully explain. One evening, as they sat on the stone steps near the harbor, sharing a stale loaf of bread, Elodie glanced at him. Do you always sneak out just to wander the streets? Clément let out a quiet laugh. You wouldn't understand. In my house, even breathing feels like it needs permission. Elodie raised an eyebrow. Don't you already have everything? Clément was silent for a long moment before taking another bite of bread. Everything, except the right to choose. Over time, the two became inseparable. One from the streets, the other from nobility. They met in the hidden corners of Paris, the narrow alleyways, the abandoned rooftops, beneath the bridges where Elodie often sought shelter when it rained. Clément spoke of the grand parties he was forced to attend, the suffocating expectations that came with his name. Elodie spoke of hunger so deep she had to steal just to stay alive. One day I'll leave that place, Clément mused, staring at the horizon. Live on my own terms. Elodie smirked. Then come live with me. Though playful, there was a rare sincerity in her voice. We'll run far away, somewhere no one can find us. Clément chuckled, but he didn't disagree. Neither of them knew that day would come sooner than expected, and not in the way they had imagined. The truth unveiled. Clément was not just another wealthy boy. He was the son of a powerful family, one that harbored secrets they intended to keep buried forever. One day, while sneaking into his father's study, Clément stumbled upon a stack of old documents, contracts filled with strange names and suspicious dealings. His breath hitched as he skimmed through them, unease creeping up his spine. But then, among the pages, he saw a name that froze him in place, Elodie's surname. At first, he didn't understand. But the deeper he dug, the clearer the horrifying truth became. His father was connected to the disappearance of Elodie's family. He didn't know the full extent of what had happened, but one thing was certain. Elodie was not just a homeless girl wandering the streets. His family had taken something from her. And when Clément decided to warn Elodie, he failed to realize that someone was watching him. The last time Clément was free, that night, Clément slipped out of his house as he always did. He didn't know this time would be his last. His heart pounded as he ran through the dimly lit streets, searching frantically. Finally, he spotted Elodie, perched on a stone ledge near the Seine. Without hesitation, he ran up to her, breathless. Elodie, I need to talk to you. She frowned. Why are you so worked up? Clément grabbed her wrist, pulling her into a secluded alley. Lowering his voice, he unfolded a crumpled piece of paper and held it out. I found this in my father's study. Elodie's eyes fell on the list of names scrawled across the page. Among them, one stood out, a name she would never forget. Her mother's. The wind howled through the alley, but Elodie no longer felt the cold. What is this? She whispered. Clément swallowed hard. I don't know exactly, but I think my father did something to your family. For a long moment, Elodie didn't move. Then her hands clenched into fists, her gaze burning with a fire Clément had never seen before. I have to go inside. What? Clément recoiled. No, you can't. If they catch you, I don't care, Elodie snapped. If they did something to my mother, I need to know. Clément stared at her, realizing there was nothing he could say to stop her. So instead, he did the only thing he could. Unhooking a small key from his belt, he pressed it into Elodie's hand. This is the key to my father's storage room, he said hurriedly. I don't know what's inside, but if you want answers, this might help. Elodie looked at the key, then back at Clément. You're coming with me, right? Without hesitation, Clément nodded. Of course. Neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching them from the shadows. The Great Escape in the Night Betrayal by Family. Clément had never come home this late before. As he stepped through the gates, a sense of unease settled in his chest. And the moment the study doors swung open, he knew he had walked into a trap. His father stood there, eyes as cold as steel. You have read what you were never meant to see, Clément. He froze. Father, what is this? Why is Elodie's mother's name on that list? The man didn't answer. He simply gave a nod. Immediately, two guards stepped into the room. No! Clément stepped back, but it was too late. A rough hand grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the back of the house. From now on, you will never leave this house again. He struggled, but it was useless. And that was the last time Clément was free. Locked away, imprisoned by his own family. And the only person who could save him was Elodie. A bold gamble. The next morning, Elodie appeared at the gates of the grand estate where Clément was being held. She no longer wore her ragged old coat. Instead, she had on a cleaner dress, stolen from a clothesline the night before. Her messy hair had been neatly combed, and with her round cheeks flushed from the cold, she looked just like a country girl seeking work in the city. A middle-aged maid stepped out, eyeing her suspiciously. Who are you? Elodie lowered her head, her voice soft but firm. I heard the mistress is looking for a new maid. The woman narrowed her eyes. Who told you that? I heard it at the market. My mother used to work in a house like this, but she passed away, Elodie said, feigning sorrow. I just need a job, a place to sleep. The maid hesitated for a moment before muttering, the mistress doesn't like hiring strangers. But she's in a good mood today. You're lucky. The iron gates creaked open. Elodie had made it inside. The infiltration. As Elodie stepped through the heavy gates, she heard the old hinges screeching against the cold air. The garden inside was neatly trimmed, but to her, it was nothing more than an obstacle course she would have to navigate. The maid said nothing more and simply gestured for her to follow. The grand hallway stretched before them, lined with velvet carpets, golden chandeliers, and towering portraits. An entirely different world from the streets Elodie had known. Eyes forward. No snooping, no questions. The woman's voice was clipped as they turned into the kitchen. You will work here. Elodie nodded quickly, her sharp gaze darting around. A polished wooden counter, gleaming copper pans, the lingering scent of roasted meat and fresh bread. But more importantly, a door at the far end. Somewhere beyond it, she knew, was the key. But she had to be patient. Who's the new girl? A sharp voice cut in. Elodie looked up to see a younger woman, likely the head cook, scrutinizing her. New hire, the maid answered. Starting today. The cook gave Elodie a long look. You know how to clean? Yes. Then get started. Elodie didn't argue. She quietly picked up a rag and began working like an obedient child. But every movement, every glance, was calculated. She hadn't come here to be a servant. She had come to save Clément. The kitchen was the perfect place to observe. No one paid her any attention as they busied themselves with their tasks. Elodie took advantage of that, memorizing doors, hallways, and faces. But the most important thing, she needed to find out who had the key. The day passed slowly. Elodie scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and completed countless errands without complaint. By evening, when the household had finished dining, she spotted him. A tall man entered the kitchen, his silver-streaked hair combed neatly, his black suit crisp and pristine. There was no mistaking him. Antoine Dufresne, Clément's father. The moment he stepped in, the air in the kitchen grew tense. Every servant fell silent, lowering their heads. Elodie did the same, but her heart pounded in her chest. This was the man who had imprisoned Clément. This was the man who might know what happened to her mother, Lucille. His deep voice broke the silence. The maid from earlier stepped forward. Yes, sir? Antoine didn't look at her. He simply pulled out a silver keyring. The keys. Elodie's breath caught in her throat. Check all the locks tonight, his voice was like ice. No one enters or leaves without my order. Lucille nodded, taking the keys before turning away. Elodie gritted her teeth. The keys were in Lucille's hands. Now there was only one thing left to do. Steal them. The escape at midnight, Paris slept. But within the Dufresne estate, a bold plan was already in motion. Elodie crouched in the shadows, her eyes locked onto Lucille, the woman carrying the keys. She couldn't act too soon, but she also couldn't wait much longer. Every second Clément remained locked away was a second too long. As the clock struck midnight, Lucille rose from her seat, keys in hand, and began her rounds, checking the doors and gates. This was the moment Elodie had been waiting for. Silently, she followed. She moved like a whisper through the corridors, careful not to make a sound, and then, as Lucille paused to lock a door, Elodie struck. In a flash, her small fingers snatched the keyring. Lucille gasped, spinning around. Who's there? No answer. She muttered curses under her breath, but she had no idea that she had just been robbed in her own home. Elodie exhaled, clutching the cold metal in her hand. Now it was time to act. Breaking Clément free, the lock wasn't difficult to pick. A soft click echoed in the dimly lit room as the door swung open. In the darkness, Clément sat slumped against the wall, his head snapped up, eyes widening. You actually came, he whispered, disbelief and relief warring in his voice. Elodie tossed him the keys. What are you waiting for? We need to leave. Now. Without hesitation, Clément unlocked the chain around his ankle, wincing as he stood. His legs were weak from days of captivity, but Elodie didn't give him time to recover. She grabbed his hand, pulling him forward. Silence followed them as they slipped through the corridors, until, I knew you would come back. A voice rang out behind them. The confrontation Antoine Dufresne stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his expression unreadable. Clément, his voice was unsettlingly calm. You really think you can leave? Clément clenched his fists. I'm never staying here again. Antoine exhaled, almost amused. Then slowly he reached into his coat and pulled out a pistol. Elodie instinctively stepped in front of Clément. She wouldn't let him be taken back. And she had an advantage. Antoine stood on higher ground. Without hesitation, Elodie kicked his knee. Antoine lost his balance, stumbling, slipping, and fell. A sickening thud echoed through the hall. Antoine Dufresne lay motionless. Clément barely glanced at him before turning to Elodie. Let's go. And they ran, into the night, into freedom, through the garden, through the iron gates, out of the mansion, out of the PAM, out of the darkness that had imprisoned Clément all his life. Breathless, the two children stopped in a deserted street. For the first time in years, Clément looked up at the Parisian sky without walls surrounding him. He turned to Elodie, his smile shaky but genuine. Thank you. Elodie flipped her hair back. That makes 2 coins you owe me now. Clément let out a laugh, a real laugh. They had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But at least tonight they were free. A choice that changed everything. And so, in the heart of Paris, 2 children from opposite worlds walked away together, leaving behind the walls that had imprisoned Clément and the painful memories that had haunted Elodie. Tonight, they did not know what the future held, but at least for now, they had won their freedom. Life is not determined by where we are born, but by the choices we dare to make. Clément could have accepted life in a gilded cage, but he chose to fight for his own fate. Elodie could have walked away, but she chose to turn back and save the only friend she had. And that choice changed everything. Freedom is never given, it must be taken. Courage is never easy, but a true friendship, a bold decision, sometimes that alone is enough to rewrite destiny.